On June 25, 1876, along the banks of the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory, one of the most shocking defeats in U.S. military history took place. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and more than 200 men of the 7th Cavalry were wiped out in a single battle. This moment, remembered as Custer's last stand, has echoed through American history for nearly 150 years. But what really happened on that hot summer day? And what tactical mistakes led to the destruction of an entire command at the hands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors? To understand the Battle of the Little Bighorn, we need to picture the setting and the two forces that would soon collide. In the summer of 1876,
Listen to the cries
thousands
of
of
the spirits who
Lakota,
guide
Sioux,
us now.
Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho people had gathered in a vast encampment along the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory. Estimates place the population at around 7,000 to 8,000, including 1,500 to 2,500 warriors. This was not just a village. It was the largest Native alliance ever assembled on the Northern Plains, a coalition drawn together by leaders such as Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, determined to resist being forced onto reservations. Against them stood the United States 7th Cavalry, about 600 soldiers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Custer was a Civil War veteran, ambitious and famously aggressive. He believed speed and surprise were his greatest weapons. But in this campaign, his confidence blinded him to the reality he faced. The land itself would shape the coming battle. The rolling prairie stretched for miles, broken by steep ridges, ravines, and the winding Little Bighorn River. To the untrained eye, it was open country. To the native warriors who had hunted and fought there for generations, it was a landscape they knew intimately, every rise, every draw, every place to conceal or strike. Custer believed he was facing only a few hundred fighters. He assumed the village was smaller, scattered, and vulnerable to a fast attack. But the truth was very different. What lay before him was a force larger and more unified than any he had ever faced. The stage was set for disaster, and the ground along the Little Bighorn would soon bear witness to one of the most lopsided defeats in U.S. Army history. With the native village stretched out for nearly 3 miles along the Little Bighorn River, Custer believed he could break it apart with speed and precision. His plan was bold but dangerously flawed. He divided his regiment into 3 separate wings. Major Marcus Reno, with about 140 men, was ordered to strike directly into the southern end of the encampment. At the same time, Captain Frederick Benteen, leading roughly 125 troopers, was sent to sweep left to block any possible escape. Custer himself, with over 200 men under his immediate command, would circle north, then descend on the village from above. The design was classic Custer, a 3-pronged attack meant to surround, shock, and scatter the enemy before they could react.
Forward,
By
men,
hitting from
to
multiple
victory!
directions at once, he believed the village would dissolve into chaos and victory would come quickly. But the logic of this maneuver depended entirely on one fatal assumption, that the native force was small. In reality, Custer was cutting his regiment into isolated fragments, separated by miles of difficult terrain, unable to see or support one another. Once divided, each detachment would be left to face the full weight of native resistance alone. What Custer saw as a brilliant strike was in truth a gamble built on misinformation. And as his men rode into the valley, the flaws in that plan would soon become a matter of life and death. When Major Reno's men charged into the southern edge of the camp, the first warriors they met did not stand and fight. Instead, many pulled back, retreating across the valley. To Custer's troopers, it looked like the beginning of a rout, the exact reaction they had hoped for. But this was no collapse. It was a deliberate tactic. Within minutes, hundreds of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors regrouped and surged back with overwhelming force. They fought from horseback with extraordinary speed, circling and striking from multiple directions. This style of combat was unlike the rigid formations of the U.S. cavalry. It was fluid, fast, and terrifyingly effective. The native fighters used the land as an ally, riding through ravines and ridges, appearing and vanishing with sudden violence. They shouted war cries, pounded the air with gunfire, and filled the sky with arrows, breaking the soldiers' focus and shaking their discipline. The effect was not only physical, but psychological, designed to disrupt the cohesion of any skirmish line the cavalry tried to form. Key leaders guided the counterattack. Crazy Horse the Oglala, Lakota war leader, drove his warriors forward with fearless charges.
For our land, for our families,
Gall a hunk
for our
papa.
future.
Lakota chief coordinated strikes that cut into Reno's exposed flanks. And behind them, Sitting Bull, whose vision had inspired the gathering of tribes, maintained the spiritual resolve that held the alliance together. What began as a feigned retreat transformed into a full-scale counteroffensive. The speed, coordination, and determination of the native warriors turned Reno's assault into a bloody reversal, forcing his men to break and fall back in confusion. It was the first sign that the balance of this battle was shifting, and that Custer's plan was unraveling faster than he could ever imagine. As the battle unfolded, Custer's carefully divided plan began to collapse piece by piece. Major Reno was the first to feel the full force of the native counterattack. At the southern end of the valley, his 140 men rode in with confidence, firing volleys and driving back a few defenders. But the illusion of victory vanished almost instantly. Hundreds of warriors struck his exposed flank, swarming from cover and closing in from multiple directions. Reno's line wavered, then broke. In a chaotic retreat across the river, dozens of his men were cut down. By the time he regrouped on the bluffs above the valley, Reno had lost nearly a quarter of his command and was badly shaken. Instead of pressing forward, he dug in, preparing to defend what ground he could hold. Captain Benteen, meanwhile, had been ordered to sweep the left and block any escape routes, but his progress was slow, delayed by difficult terrain and unclear instructions. By the time he rejoined Reno, the momentum of the battle had already shifted. The two officers, now together, found themselves forced into a desperate defense, holding out against repeated charges, while watching smoke rise from the direction where Custer had gone. Custer, leading more than 200 men, pressed north toward what he believed was the unguarded end of the village. Instead, he rode straight into the largest concentration of warriors. The encampment emptied as Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho fighters poured across the plain to meet him. In minutes, the numerical advantage was overwhelming 10 warriors for every soldier. On a series of ridges now known as Last Stand Hill, Custer's men tried to form a defensive perimeter. Carbine fire cracked through the dust, but there was no escape route, no reinforcements, and no high ground strong enough to save them. Native fighters closed in from every direction, firing rifles captured in earlier battles, loosing arrows, and charging again and again on horseback. The soldiers fought hard, but each wave of defenders was replaced by another. The end came swiftly and brutally. Surrounded on all sides, the 7th Cavalry Detachment was annihilated to the last man. Over 200 bodies were left scattered across the ridge, and coolies, including Custer himself, cut down with his brothers and closest officers at his side. Not a single soldier under his direct command survived to tell the tale. The silence that followed was as shocking as the battle itself. For the native warriors, it was a moment of triumph, a defense of their people and way of life. For the U.S. Army, it was an almost unthinkable catastrophe, the complete destruction of a major detachment in the field. Custer's last stand had become a reality, and its mystery would endure because no one who stood with him lived to describe those final moments. Why did Custer and his men meet such a devastating end at the Little Bighorn? The answer lies in a series of critical miscalculations, combined with the undeniable strengths of the Native Alliance. First, Custer fatally underestimated his enemy. He believed there were only a few hundred warriors in the valley, when in fact there were well over 1,500, perhaps even more than 2,000. This misjudgment set the stage for disaster. Second, he divided his regiment into fragments that were too small to withstand concentrated resistance. Reno, Benteen, and Custer each operated miles apart, unable to see or support one another. Once separated, each detachment faced superior numbers without hope of reinforcement. Third, Custer's reconnaissance was poor, and his confidence blinded him to warning signs. Scouts urged caution, but he pressed forward convinced that speed alone would bring victory. That overconfidence sealed his fate. On the other side, the native warriors held every advantage. Their numbers were greater, their movements faster, and their knowledge of the land unmatched. They fought not just as soldiers, but as defenders of their families, their homes, and their way of life. That determination fueled a ferocity the 7th Cavalry could not match. In the end, the clash at the Little Bighorn was less about one man's bravery or recklessness, and more about a fundamental imbalance between overconfidence and preparation, between rigid tactics and flexible strategy, between an army fighting to enforce policy and a people fighting to survive. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was for the Native Alliance a stunning victory. For the United States Army, it was a humiliating and unforgettable defeat. Custer's last stand entered legend not because of glory, but because it revealed how quickly arrogance and poor strategy can turn into catastrophe. The lessons are clear. Underestimating an enemy dividing forces too thinly and relying on flawed assumptions can lead to total destruction. Overconfidence is as dangerous on the battlefield as any weapon. Yet the legacy of this battle extends far beyond tactics. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, it was proof that unity and determination could defeat even a professional army. But it also unleashed the full power of the United States in response. In the years that followed, relentless campaigns forced the Plains tribes onto reservations, and the independence they had defended at Little Bighorn was steadily crushed. The battle stands today as both a moment of native triumph and a turning point of tragic consequence, a reminder of the strength of resistance and of the heavy price that followed. The Battle of the Little Bighorn reminds us that in war, arrogance and misjudgment can cost an entire army. Custer's fate is still debated today. Was he a brave commander who stood his ground, or a reckless leader whose overconfidence led his men to destruction? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your perspective in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more in-depth explorations of history's most dramatic battles.